1941 until the start of the First World War, made their way out of the Pale of Settlement, out of that part of the world, and in some cases made their way to then Palestine, in many cases to the United States or to Great Britain or to other parts of the world. We can start this story in 1917, which was the Bolshevik Revolution, which ended the Pale of Settlement. My own grandparents, my mother's parents, were able to move from Belarus to Moscow, a city that they could not have dreamed of living in before under the Tsars. And the Bolsheviks, with their initial conversation about the brotherhood of nationalities, allowed the Jews out of the Pale of Settlement. We can begin this story in the 1930s, when Joseph Stalin replaced Vladimir Lenin, actually in 1923, but was the supreme ruler of Russia. And probably with a smile, maybe even a smirk, Stalin did something which we Jews have wrestled with for centuries, if not millennia. He asked and he answered the question, who is a Jew? We ask the question, mi Yehudi, who is a Jew? And we still argue among ourselves, but Stalin answered that question in the 1930s for the Soviet Union. And what he said was that for the Soviet Union, if you were born to two Jewish parents, you were a Jew. It didn't matter whether you spoke Yiddish or didn't, whether you believed in God or didn't, you were a Jew. He determined it was a nationality. He also said that if you were born to a mixed marriage, that at the age of 16, when you yourself had to get what was called an internal passport, not for travel abroad, but for documentation inside the Soviet Union, then you could choose between the two nationalities of your parents. All of this would be reflected in that internal passport from the age of 16, in what became infamously known as the Piatea Grafa, the fifth line of the passport, because that said nationalnost, nationality. And for the Soviet Union, from the point of Stalin forward, your nationality was determined at the age of 16. It was included in your internal passport, the document that you had to show when you applied for a job, when you applied for school, when you applied for a residence permit. You had to show that document. It identified you as a Jew. And again, it didn't matter whether you knew what Passover was or Purim was or Rosh Hashanah was or not. You were defined by nationality. And so in the Soviet censuses which took place periodically, Jews were part of the census because they were a nationality like Georgians and Ukrainians and Belarusians and Latvians and Kazakhs. They were a nationality. Or we could begin the story with the impact of the Second World War on the millions of Jews living within the Soviet borders, many of whom fought on behalf of what was called the Red Army, Krasnaya Armia, of the Soviet Union, many with great valor, with great distinction, and also many of whom were killed by the invading German forces, often with collaboration locally. Perhaps Babi Yar is the most infamous of those stories in the ravine just on the edge of Kiev in Ukraine. But there were many others, the Minsk ghetto, many killing fields of Jews. So we could start with the impact of the Second World War on Soviet Jews and their identity. Or we could start after the war with the arrival of the first Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union. Interestingly, perhaps many don't know it, the Soviet Union was among the supporters of Israel's rebirth in 1947, 1948. They supported the partition plan. They had their own reasons for doing it, but their voice was crucial to this. And so there came diplomatic relations with Israel. And who was that ambassador who arrived in Moscow? You can look at the iconic picture of that ambassador in front of the synagogue. By the way, if you look just behind me on this screen, that synagogue, the synagogue on Arkhipova Street, otherwise known as the Choral Synagogue, the central synagogue of Moscow, and for many years, by the way, the only real synagogue in Moscow during the communist period. That ambassador was named Golda Meir. To the shock and surprise of Soviet authorities, tens of thousands of Jews showed up at that synagogue right behind me on the street to greet the first Israeli ambassador to Moscow. So we can start there with the impact of that on Jewish consciousness. Or we could fast forward to 1967, the Six-Day War, which had a huge impact on Soviet Jewry, on Soviet Jewish identity in this communist land in which they were trying to extinguish all remnants of Jewish thought and Jewish being. The Six-Day War was not just a war between Israel and the Arab world. For many Soviet Jews, it was a war between Israel and Soviet proxies, between Israel and Soviet weapons. And lo and behold, in 6 days, Israel defeated the Arab armies armed by the Soviet Union. It was a stunning moment for Soviet Jews to see an Israel that was able to defeat in war those who wanted to destroy it. Had a profound effect on many, many, many Soviet Jews. Suddenly being Jewish was a source of great pride. Not only could we think, not only could we study science and medicine, but we could also, if necessary, fight and defend ourselves. And that was the state of Israel. And with it came something else, a word that perhaps some of you will recall, some of you will hear for the first time, the word samizdat. Samizdat is a Russian word that combines two words within it, which means self-publication. And among the books that were, if you will, self-published or self-written, self-copied, self-distributed in the Soviet Union in this time was a legendary book by the author Leon Uris, the book Exodus. This was passed hand to hand. It obviously could never be officially bought. In fact, you ran risks if you were found with the book. But the combination of reading Exodus, the story of how, in fact, the Ben Canaan brothers, Akiva and Barak, basically walked from the shtetl, from the Pale of Settlement, to Palestine, and began to establish their presence together with other chalutzim, other pioneers, many from Russia. It was a very powerful, inspiring story that led to the creation of the State of Israel, the defense of the State of Israel, the rebirth of the State of Israel. So the 67 war, the appearance of Exodus, created a new surge of pride in this authoritarian state, which hoped to extinguish all remnants of Jewish culture, Jewish religion, even as, ironically, Stalin ensured Jewish continuity by insisting that Jews were a nationality, and you didn't count them by who came to the synagogue, you counted them by how they were born. And that brings us to 1969 and the beginning of this conversation in a very practical way. In 1969, 18 families from Soviet Georgia. Now remember, in the Soviet Union, there were 15 so-called republics, call them states, call them provinces. They were all under the total domination of Moscow and the Kremlin. But Georgia was one of those 15. It had a venerable Jewish tradition that dated back literally a couple of thousand years, one of the oldest, if not the oldest Jewish community anywhere. Those 18 Georgian Jewish families, Gruzinski Yevrei, Georgian Jews, wrote a letter to the United Nations appealing for the right to go to Israel. To understand this is to understand that these 18 families took on the most powerful authoritarian, totalitarian nation on earth. They knew that the likeliest outcome of this would be harassment, perhaps imprisonment, loss of job, but they did it. In a sense, what they were saying to the world was Shelach et ami, let my people go, or in Russian, Atpusti narod moy, let my people go. Let us go back to our homeland, our ancestral homeland. Let us reunite with our families in Israel. And that was, in many ways, the beginning of the campaign for Jews in the Soviet Union. There were things done quietly before. One thing I would mention very importantly was that as early as 1952, shortly after the arrival of Golda Meir in Moscow, Israel set up a very quiet clandestine office called Lishkat HaKesher. In English, call it the Liaison Bureau. It reported directly to the Prime Minister of Israel. It was a secret operation to try and stay in touch with Jews behind the Iron Curtain, most especially in the Soviet Union. Very quietly, over many years, trying to share information, trying to understand who were people willing to go out on the front lines, where were the pockets of Jewish energy. But in 1969, it spilled out into the public with this letter from the 18 Georgian Jewish families. And what happened? The Soviet Jewry movement in its modern incarnation was born in a massive way. And it continued from then until 1991, when no one could have imagined, of course, that the Soviet Union itself would become a historical artifact, that the new name for the country would be the former Soviet Union, Bывший Советский Союз. I can never say it happily enough, Bывший, former Soviet Union, with each of those 15 states or republics becoming their own independent nations, and with the gates wide open from 1991 forward. But in those 22 years, from 1969 to 1991, the Soviet Jewry movement was a roller coaster with massive gyrations in what happened, in Jews being allowed to leave, not being allowed to leave, in Jews being harassed, imprisoned. And let me take you through some of the elements of what that meant. The Soviet Jewry movement, as I said at the outset, is among the most successful human rights movements in modern history. What were the basic elements that made it successful? The first and foremost, unquestionably, was the extraordinary courage of some Soviet Jews. People today know the name Natan Sharansky, for example, and he has become emblematic of the whole Soviet Jewry movement. But there were others. There were others before Sharansky, during Sharansky, after Sharansky, others who went to prison, others who spent many years in refusenik status, others whose family lives were disrupted totally for years and years inside the borders of the Soviet Union. Without those Soviet Jews putting themselves on the line, their lives on the line, we would not be talking about a Soviet Jewry movement. So they're number one. Number two, Israel. I'll talk about it more in the next session. But in order for the Soviet Union to swallow its pride and to let any Jews go, in a country where the word emigration, emigration, was not part of the vocabulary, by and large, they had to find a rationale that might somehow validate why some Jews were being allowed to leave the country, but not others, not other nationalities, not other people. After all, it wasn't just Jews who might want to leave the Soviet Union. It wasn't just anti-Semitism that was suffocating. It was tyranny that was suffocating. It was authoritarianism that was suffocating. It was the KGB that was suffocating. And Israel played into Soviet hands here. Said the Soviets, if we can construct this not as emigration, but as repatriation, repatriatia, then in a way, maybe we can separate the Jews from others who want to leave the Soviet Union, by playing along with this notion of, well, after all, Jews are just going home to Israel, their ancestral homeland, home to their families in Israel. Third, the United States government. Besides Israel, there was no government in the world that stood shoulder to shoulder with Jews in the Soviet Union as the United States government did. Rhetorically, there were. Rhetorically, there were some Australian prime ministers, and I want to give a special shout out to Australia and Canada and several European countries who spoke about letting Jews leave the Soviet Union if they wished. But it's a very, very big but. Only one country was willing to put its own policies on the line and connect them to the fate of those who wanted to emigrate. And that was the United States. That was the United States Congress. And there were two people particularly associated with this who are legendary in our history. Charles Vanek in the House and Henry Jackson in the Senate. They forged the Jackson-Vanek Amendment of the mid-1970s. And what that amendment said was, if the Soviet Union or any other non-market economy, meaning a communist economy, wanted the benefit of most favored nation trade status in the United States, they had to allow free emigration. If they did not, they would not get the MFN, the most favored nation trade status, and therefore their products would be at a disadvantage in the American market. Not only that, but the United States also passed the lesser known Stevenson Amendment, which tied the extension of credits to the Soviet Union with their policy on emigration. The combination of Jackson-Vanek and Stevenson sent a powerful message to Soviet authorities, one they tried to ignore, one they pretended didn't affect them, but it said, you want to do business with the United States? Here's the price of doing business, emigration. Otherwise, find other markets. The United States was alone. It brought together Democrats and Republicans. In truth, Richard Nixon, president at the time, then Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger were not in favor. This was an action taken by the US Congress that was in a way imposed on the administration. The administration did not want to have its hands tied, but its hands were tied. And by the way, for those who followed Steve Bain's earlier seminar on AJC history, the first legislative achievement of AJC in the early part of the 20th century was the abrogation of the USRussia Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. Also over the way Russia at the time, Tsarist Russia, treated Jews. So there was even a precedent for Jackson-Vanek, and certainly in AJC history. So third was the United States. Fourth were Jews around the world. Jews heard the words, Shelach et ami, let my people go. They saw this as a modern day exodus, a challenge for Jews, many of whom will tell you, and I'm among them, that we had failed in the Second World War to open the gates to distant countries, to Jews fleeing Europe. This was our challenge. Our challenge was to prove we had learned the lessons of history, and never again would Jews be turned away because of an indifferent government or an indifferent society. And so American Jews, Canadian Jews, British Jews, Australian Jews, French Jews, Latin American Jews, go down the list, all organized, sometimes in a disorganized way. After all, we're Jews. So it wasn't one organization. It was sometimes competing organizations, some a little bit more establishment, some a little bit more out there. But this mass movement of Jews around the world saying, Hineni, here I am, grabbing the hands of Soviet Jews still behind the Iron Curtain, adopting them, twinning in bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, putting on bracelets with the name of a refusenik, wanting to get out but unable to get out, humanizing this. So So it went from the macro, the mass movement, to the individual. We knew names, we knew family structures, we knew situations. This movement did not give the Soviet Union a moment of peace. I'll offer you just one example for now. On 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., sat not far from the Capitol Hilton Hotel, the Soviet embassy to the United States. Every single day, 5 days a week at lunchtime, every single day for some 20 years, there was a vigil to free Soviet Jews, with a group of people standing just opposite the embassy, holding up placards and banners, urging the Soviet Union to let the Jews go. And when the police permitted, some of those people would cross 16th Street right in front of the embassy itself, as embassy workers would go in or out for lunch, and they would hand them leaflets saying, "Отпусти народ мой, let my people go," with the faces of Kosharovsky and Noodle, and by the way, Edelstein, the Speaker of the Knesset, and Sharansky and others, depending on the year we're talking about. They humanized it, they popularized it. And my final pillar of the Soviet Jewry movement, non-Jews. One of the amazing successes of the Soviet Jewry movement was to turn it into a mass human rights movement. Yes, these were Jews. Yes, they were being denied the right to study Hebrew, to go to synagogue. Yes, they were being denied the right to go to Israel in so many cases. Yes, this was a Jewish issue, but not only, it was a human rights issue. It was a humanitarian cause. These were victims of tyranny. And it was astonishing to see the range of people who joined with us in the Soviet Jewry movement, from the labor movement, from the civil rights movement, from the Christian world. Indeed, for many years, AJC itself hosted the National Interreligious Task Force on Soviet Jewry, which was chaired by people like Sister Anne Gillen, a Catholic nun, and many other Christian leaders who put themselves on the line here in the United States in front of the Soviet embassy, by the way, in trying to go to the Soviet Union in order to make contact with individual Jews when they could. This explains the mass movement. Let me wrap up, because there's a lot more and it's an issue close to my heart and I could go on for a very long time. But let me wrap up with two very personal stories that help explain the profound impact of this mass modern day exodus. And by the way, we're soon to celebrate Passover, maybe not exactly as we normally would because of the pandemic, but every Passover, I think not just of the Jews who and their exodus from Egypt, I think of the modern day exodus that my generation also witnessed. In 1974, I had a very unique opportunity. I was one of 6 Americans selected in a US-Soviet exchange of scholars and teachers. I was sent to the Soviet Union and I worked first in Moscow at school number 45, and then in Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, in school number 185. Those months in the Soviet Union before I was arrested near the synagogue just behind me, held for 3 days and 2 nights, and then sent on a plane to Helsinki. Those months were transformative and help explain why I do the work I do at AJC. I want to share with you just one moment from those months. It was Simchat Torah. And I had heard from Elie Wiesel and others that this was one of the few days that Jews showed up, had the courage to show up at the synagogue, like the one behind me on Arkhipova Street. And I don't come from a religious family. And I remember leaving school number 45, taking the metro to the stop near the synagogue. And as I was walking to the synagogue, wondering, why am I going? No one's going to show up. What am I doing here? And ironically, perpendicular to our heap of a street where this synagogue is located, the street name is Menisci Street. For those of you who know Jewish history from the 17th century, Bogdan Khmelnytsky was responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews. I walked down Khmelnytsky Street. I came to the intersection with our heap of a street. There was a bit of a slope going down. I turned the corner. I looked into that street, and to my absolute amazement, I saw thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews filling the street. By the way, no doubt some of those Jews were probably not Jews. They were KGB agents keeping a close eye on everything. But I remember to this day, I stopped. I was paralyzed. I was transfixed. I was hypnotized. I saw thousands of Jews gathered, some in circles doing a version of the horror, some just standing there. The message which was loud and clear for me and for the world was, we're 1 mile from the Kremlin. They've tried to silence us. They've tried to destroy our faith, our belief, our culture, our history, our legacy. They failed. We are now 57 years into communism, but we remember Simchat Torah. We know where the synagogue is. We know the KGB will be there. We know they'll be taking photographs, but they're not going to stop us. And in that moment, I understood the Soviet Union could not defeat the Jews. And then I fast forward to 1987. Mikhail Gorbachev had been in power for 2 years. There was talk about these new Russian words, glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring, and uskorenia, which means accelerating or speeding up. And there were questions, was he for real? Was he truly a reformer or not? Well, it certainly didn't show in the emigration numbers because emigration was flat, very flat those years. And then Gorbachev announced his first visit to Washington, D.C. He and Reagan had already met in Reykjavik, Iceland. The activists, including me, were there, challenging the Soviets as best we can, encouraging the Americans to raise the issue. But now Gorbachev was coming to Washington, D.C. We had 36 days to organize ourselves. What should we do for the arrival of Gorbachev in Washington and for the struggle to free Jews in the Soviet Union? And we don't have the time. I will simply tell you that there was a lot of concern about having a mass public demonstration. In Washington, the largest Jewish demonstration in history had been roughly 10,000 people during the 6-day war, when AJC President Morris Abrams spoke to the crowd. Would people come out? And if they didn't, would we show weakness rather than strength? Along came Natan Sharansky, who had been freed from the Gulag a year earlier. And he said to us, go for broke, go for broke. Go across the country, go to every campus, go to every synagogue, go to every church, go for broke. And we did. And more than 250,000 people came. The largest single gathering of Jews and their friends ever in the history of the United States. And Vice President George H.W. Bush came, and Peter, Paul, and Mary came, and a panoply of America's political leaders, Republicans, Democrats, governors, mayors, senators, congressmen, African Americans, Latinos, you name it, they were there. And the next day, the day after, Gorbachev came to the White House to meet with Ronald Reagan. And according to those who were present in the room, President Reagan said to Mikhail Gorbachev, Mr. President, yesterday, more than 250,000 Americans, not Jews, Americans, walked past the White House saying, let my people go. Their message was for you, President Gorbachev. Heed their message. Again, the United States put itself on the line together with us. Gorbachev heeded the message. And in the next 4 years, until the Soviet Union ended as a nation, well over 1 million people emigrated from the Soviet Union, one of the most successful human rights campaigns in history, and one of the most extraordinary moments in Jewish history. Ali, back to you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating. Just a reminder that people can ask questions by emailing questions, plural, at ajc.org or by using the Q&A feature in Zoom. David, our first question comes from Mindy Reiser in Washington, D.C. And Mindy wants to know, how did word about the Refusenik movement spread within the Soviet Union, and to whom did it appeal the most?
So there were, at any moment in time, literally thousands of refuseniks in the Soviet Union. In Russian, the word refusal is atkaz. So an atkaznik was a person who received a refusal. It means they applied to leave based on what I said earlier, which was the notion of repatriation to the Jewish homeland Israel on the basis of family reunification. They were refused. They were now in refusenik status. They were all over the Soviet Union. And at any given moment, there might have been thousands of them. In a way, I would describe it, and I've met with many of them in my various visits to the Soviet Union during this period. I would say that they were after the before, because they were no longer a part of the Soviet Union. They had lost their jobs, they were ostracized, but they were before the after. They didn't know when they'd be allowed to leave, if they'd be allowed to leave, and also, and this will be for the next session, 99% or more had never been outside the Soviet Union. So their whole impression of the West, whether it was Israel or the United States, was based on what? There was no Google, there was no internet. It was based on rumors, on reports, on smuggled documents, on misinformation, on disinformation, on all kinds of things. But the refuseniks stuck together. And one of them works for the American Jewish Committee. I hope he's on the call right now, Sam Klieger. He was a refusenik for some 10 years, and he would tell you that even though they were isolated, they were ostracized, they could be harassed, they could be imprisoned at any moment in time, their children could be expelled from school, their college-age students might be denied admission to a university or an institute, they had a certain inner freedom. Sharansky talks about that in his book, Fear No Evil, and I strongly recommend his book to any of you who haven't read it yet, Fear No Evil. There was an inner freedom, and they connected with each other, and they studied Hebrew. And they listened to Jewish and Israeli music, and they tried to understand holidays. And George Shultz, who's one of the heroes of this story, this whole story, in 1987, just before Gorbachev came to Washington, Shultz went to Moscow, in part to help prepare the visit to Washington. And guess what Shultz did while he was in Moscow? He hosted a Seder. George Shultz, a non-Jew, hosted a Seder for Soviet Jewish refuseniks and essentially defied the Soviet Union to stop them from coming to the venue. So the refuseniks were together. Some of them were very visible in public. Some of them insisted on demonstrating and then getting thrown into the prison for 2 weeks or 2 months or even 2 years. Others were very quiet. And you can never really tell when you applied whether you'd be refused or not. I'll just share with you one anecdote, and I collected a lot of the Soviet Jewish humor of this period. So there was one Soviet Jew who was refused, and he was called to the KGB, and there was a conversation back and forth, and he said to the KGB official, "I don't understand. Why have you refused me? I'm an engineer. Yes, I'm an engineer. But you know what? I know that American technology is 10 years ahead, maybe 20 years ahead of Soviet technology. So what can I possibly tell the Americans that they don't already know?" And the KGB official's response was, "We don't want them to know that we're 10 or 20 years behind. That's the secret." So you can never tell whether you are being kept as a refusenik just to throw everyone off guard, whether you're being kept because you genuinely might have known secrets. The word in Russian is dopusk. which means kind of a secret clearance, and there were levels of secret clearance, or whether what the secret you really knew was just how far behind the Soviet Union was, and you didn't want the Americans in the West to know it. Allie?
Thank you, David. We have a question from Rabbi Robert Maslin of Bellevue, Washington. And Rabbi wants to know, did rivalries among Jewish leaders in the USSR emerge, or was the movement mostly unified?
Rabbi, both. I mean, in one sense, it was unified because there was a common goal or a set of common goals. Let us out. Atpusti narod moy, let my people go. It was also, if we are here, let us study, let us learn Hebrew, let us pray. Those were the goals. Those were the overarching goals. But then you did have differences even within the Soviet Jewry movement there. And by the way, also here. One difference was in a way embodied by Sharansky. One constant question was, should the Soviet Jewry movement be involved with the larger human rights movement in the Soviet Union, or what we call the dissident movement? Soviet Jews, by and large, were not dissidents per se. Their goal was not to reform the Soviet Union. Their goal was to leave the Soviet Union. And that's why most of them kept dissidents separate from Soviet Jewry activists. But there were those, Sharansky was one, who bridged the two. And we had this experience as well at AJC over the issue of someone like Andrei Sakharov. It's a name that I hope many of you know. If not, I hope you'll learn about him, because for many of us, he was truly a saint. He embodied the Soviet dissident movement. He had been a physicist and one of the fathers of the hydrogen bomb. So his status in the Soviet Union was very, very elevated. He was not Jewish. On the other hand, he was also a very powerful voice for the right of Jews to leave, for the right of Israel to defend itself, even as he was trying to change the Soviet Union in so many other ways and democratize it. And the question became, should we be close to Sakharov? Should we remain distant from Sakharov? If we get entangled with Sakharov and others in the human rights movement, will that somehow prevent us from leaving the Soviet Union? Because the Kremlin will then say, aha, the truth is that you Jews don't want to just leave on the basis of repatriation. You want to undo this country. We're not going to let you do it. So that was one of the main sources of dispute. And if you ever have the chance to speak with Natan Sharansky, it's a question to ask him. What were the different schools of thought about how to deal with the larger human rights and democratization movement in the Soviet Union within the Soviet Jewish community? Allie?
Thank you so much, David. We have a question that pertains to some trends that we're seeing today. Can you discuss the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda campaign and how they so effectively targeted the global left to the point that many of the common tropes devised by the KGB, such as Zionism even equals racism, are still prevalent on the global left today, even though the Soviet Union no longer exists?
Absolutely. I'm grateful for the question. I mentioned earlier that in 1948, the Soviet Union recognized Israel, that the Soviets at the UN had given very powerful speeches on behalf of the creation, the rebirth of the state of Israel. By the way, those speeches are well worth reading. People like Andrei Gromyko and what they said at the time. The diplomatic relations existed from 1948 until 1967. The Six-Day War. And then, as I said, in a way, the Six-Day War was also a proxy war between American-supported Israel and Soviet-supported Arab nations. As a result of the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union broke its diplomatic ties with Israel and insisted that all the East European satellite states do the same. Great trivia question. Which was the one East European satellite state that refused to follow the Soviet lead and maintained its relations with Israel before 67 and after 67? The answer is Romania. But once the Soviet Union broke ties with Israel, it really unleashed its anti-Zionism campaign in a variety of ways. And when you fast forward, for example, to 1975, the year of the infamous UN resolution on Zionism as racism, and you look at the roots of how that kind of idea evolved, of equating Zionism with racism, of turning Zionism into this demonic force, which together with apartheid in South Africa at the time, were the two most evil forces on the planet. The Zionism as racism campaign largely started in Moscow. Fast forward again. In their sort of unique Soviet way, the Soviets then created the Soviet Anti-Zionist Committee. And guess who led that committee? Soviet Jews. Samuel Zivs was among them. These were Soviet Jews who were enlisted, loyal party apparatchiki, who tried to make the case that even for Soviet Jews, Zionism was anathema. It didn't get much traction, certainly not outside the Soviet Union, though they tried. And as you can tell from even inside the Soviet Union, other than the staunch party loyalists, very few people bought it. The 6-Day War, Exodus, and then as a few people made it to Israel from the Soviet Union in dribs and drabs and began to report back in their own coded language, they reported a country very different than Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda wanted you to believe. Remember, people by and large couldn't leave the Soviet Union. So every day the Soviet Union would talk about this Zionist evil force, by the way, as they would talk about the United States. Along come a few Soviet Jews who are allowed to leave over time, go to Israel, discover something totally different, find ways of conveying that information back. So lo and behold, the anti-Zionist campaign didn't have much success inside the Soviet Union, but it certainly gave a kind of philosophical rationale for much of the Arab world and their supporters at the United Nations, first in the General Assembly and then elsewhere, with this canard of Zionism as racism.
Great. Let's take one last question, David, and I think this will let us leave on an up note. During the height of the Soviet Jewry movement, you wrote a book about Soviet Jewish humor. Can you tell us why you felt strongly about writing that book, as well as maybe a favorite joke from that book?
Well, the answer is because I had a lot of interaction with Soviet Jews. During those months in the Soviet Union, a lot. And then, as we'll discuss next week, in those years that I spent in Vienna and Rome, which were the two arrival and transit points for the thousands and thousands of Jews who sooner or later were allowed to leave, and I was interacting with them on a very individual and family level. And I saw again and again how much humor played a part in their lives. They needed humor. They needed humor to brighten their lives. They needed humor as a foil against communism, against the government. And I don't have a great memory for jokes. I hear one, I try to remember it. Someone tells me another joke, it displaces the first joke. So I began to write them down on 3x5 cards in Russian on one side, and then I would translate them into English on the other side. And then one day in Rome, along comes a Soviet Jewish family. He was a professor of languages, a very scholarly individual. And we were talking, and for some reason we discovered that he's been doing the exact same thing, collecting jokes, Soviet jokes, Jewish jokes, and putting them on his cards, whether they were 3x5 or another size. And so we talked about it, and we decided, you know what, why don't we pool our efforts? And one day, when he gets eventually settled in his new home, why don't we try and write a book and see if a publisher will publish it? He was settled in California. We got together, we did the book, we found the publisher. The book is called The Jokes of Oppression. I think it's still available on eBay. Just before Ronald Reagan met with Gorbachev, I had the opportunity, as the New York Times reported, to present the book to Reagan. Reagan loved jokes, and he especially loved anti-communist jokes. And the book has a lot of anti-communist jokes as well. So if you want to see how people endure tough situations, read the humor. You know, I joked to end it, Ali, that in a way, and please understand me correctly, Gorbachev was bad for business, and Yeltsin was even worse for business. Yeltsin being the first leader after the collapse of communism in 1991, because the better things got, the fewer jokes there were. So if you really wanted the best of the jokes, it was tragically in the most difficult of times. But anyway, the book is called The Jokes of Oppression, and I hope people have a good chuckle when they read it. Thank you all, and I will look forward to being together with many of you again next week. As they would say on our heap of a street just behind me, do svidaniya. Goodbye, shalom.